and welcome to the Matmid Programme together with United Synagogue's pre-Pesach evening. I'm delighted to welcome Dayan Binstock. Thank you very much. To the Matmid Programme together with and a bit of an echo as well, why not? Thank you very much, Dayan Binstock, for joining us. Just to quickly, for those listeners or those watchers, whether it's catch up or live, just a quick introduction to what the Matmid Programme is for those who may not have heard of it. The Matmid Programme is an initiative started by a group of shuls within the US to promote text-based learning. So we have so far, we're blessed with 7 shuls in the initiative, and the way it's worked so far is that we have different units, different topics, of which 3 is given by one of the rabbis in the shul, each shul separately, and the last is given by one of the Dayanim. We've learned about kashrus. We have also learned about conversion, and please God, after Pesach, we're going to be starting a unit about Avelis, about the laws of mourning, and we're also going to be, after Shavuos, starting the Hilchah Shabbos, the laws or some of the elements of Shabbos. Now, normally we have the rabbi giving 3 in their shul and the Dayan together giving 1. But sometimes we're very fortunate to have a rabbi of a shul who is also a Dayan. So Dayan Binstock is joining us this evening. Afterwards, we're going to be hearing from Rabbi Conway of KLBD. Dayan Binstock is going to be talking about Lachma Anya, of course, the start of Magid, of Seder night, our virtual invitation. Dayan Binstock, I know it's time is at a premium before Pesach. Amongst the Dayanim, amongst the rabbis as well. I'm sure your community of St. John's Wood, I'm sure that a lot of your time is helping them prepare for Pesach. So we very much appreciate the fact that you are helping us prepare for Pesach and talking about Lachma Anya. So I'm going to hand the proverbial mic over to you. Again, thank you for your time. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Rabbi Fine, for that very kind introduction. What I'm going to do is, since I've not been able to give out text, is to share my screen. I'm told you'll be able to see me as well. So I'm just going to do that, and then we can proceed to continue. Fine. Right. Rabbi Fine, can you see my screen?
Absolutely. I see it. Good. Well.
Lovely. Okay. So what I'm going to explore is the subject of Lachma Anya, and as I say, a virtual invitation to the Seder. And since our subject is exploring the Seder itself, let's start from the beginning. And at the beginning of Magid, this is how we start. And so, some Hasidic Haggadahs actually have a Hineni Muchen Mezumah to say at the beginning of Magid. In my family, we have a nigun to which we recite and chant the Seder, and that begins with Lachma. Lachma Anya diachal abosana ba'arod emitzrayim kol dichven yeseh v'yechel kol ditzrech yeseh v'yivsach Oshavta hochlo arod Yisrael Oshavta abdei lishon haba b'nei chayrin. Now, I've always been struck by Lachma Anya because it seems to have sort of some challenges about it. The passage is familiar. This is the bread of affliction or destitution that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Anyone who is famished or hungry should come and eat. Anyone who's in need should come and celebrate the Passover sacrifice. Now we are here. Next year we'll be in the land of Israel. This year we're slaves. Next year we'll be free people. So I'm going to pose a number of questions on this passage, and we'll see about answering them. So let me just... Our questions. So in many Haggadahs, the rubric at the beginning of Lachma is raise the Seder plate and recite Lachma Anya. Okay, but you're raising a Seder plate saying this is the bread of our affliction. A Seder plate is not the bread of our affliction. So what are we talking about? Question 1. Question 2, why is it in Aramaic? The rest of the Haggadah is in Hebrew, with the exception, of course, of the very end of the Haggadah, Chad Gadya. And so why are we putting a bit in the beginning? I mean, you could say, oh, it's nice to bookend the Haggadah, if you like it in Aramaic, the middle is in Hebrew, but Chad Gadya doesn't exist in the Sephardi Haggadahs. They just end at the end of Nirtzah Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim. So why is it in Aramaic? And then the food our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Really? Our ancestors ate matzah in Egypt. Later on, Rabbi Gamliel, we will say that why do we eat matzah? Because the dough of our ancestors didn't have time to rise when they left Egypt. And so, it's strange. Why are we giving a different reason for matzah as the food we ate in Egypt? And also we're saying anyone who is famished should come and eat. Well, what sort of invitation is that? We've all got our guests around the table already, and we're sitting at the Seder and saying anyone who is famished should come and eat. And the next stage, whoever is in need should come and celebrate the Passover sacrifice. That's even more puzzling. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, the Passover sacrifice required prior booking. You had to have booked in, made your reservation of the Korban Pesach before he was slaughtered. And so how can one say Yetzeh v'Yisach was come and celebrate the Passover sacrifice? It didn't make sense. So what we're talking about. And then, even though it is in Aramaic, there's an anomaly. The final part is Lashona Haba B'nei Chorim. So why be switching away from Aramaic for a couple of words at the end? So these are some questions I'd like to pose on Lachma Anya. Let's see about what we can do to answer these questions. So the first question is not difficult to answer. In earlier times, the Seder plate contains the matzahs as well as all the other items. And you might have seen the sort of classic Seder plates which you can get today, where there are multi-layers. You've got the layers for your 3 matzahs, and then you've got the other items above. And so, as the Shulchan Aruch says, the Yagbia HaKa'ora sheyesh bo hamatzahs v'yom ha'lachma anya. So you're raising the Seder plate on which there is the matzahs as well. And so if you don't have a Seder plate which has got the matzahs, you can simply raise the matzah. My personal practice is to simply, after I've broken the matzah in half, at Yachat, I take a piece of matzah, raise it, and say, Lachma Anya. This is the matzah, the bread of affliction. And so that's simply answers that question in a straightforward way. Let's move to the more substantive questions. The Lachma Anya. Now, there are lots of creative answers as to why we're referring to the bread of affliction, and later Rabbi Gamliel refers to this in other ways. But let's explore sources. The first thing to do is, where do you first find it? Where's the first reference? Now, Lachma Anya is not found in the Mishnah or the Talmud. There we read in the Mishnah, Mazor lo kosheni, you pour out the second cup of wine for him. The Kana ben Shoel Oviv, and now the son will ask his father the following questions. And if the son's not got sufficient intelligence, the father would teach him. But what are the spaces of the questions? And so you go straight from pour out the second cup of wine to Manishtana. Lachma Anya is not there in the Mishnah. It's not there in the Talmud. Nevertheless, some have speculated that it still does originate from Talmudic times, and that's why it's in Aramaic. And so, for example, the Ravia, amongst others, Ravi was Eliezer ben Yoel Halevi of Bonn, who lived from 1140 to 1225. So he writes, people have the custom to say Lachma Anya in Aramaic, because that was their language, Aramaic. And that was because he wanted everyone to understand. It is, of course, a primary responsibility that the participants of the Seder should understand what is going on. There are more quotes to read, possibly Milondras, who said that he would translate the Haggadah into the vernacular. So again, this is right from the outset. We're doing something to indicate how the Haggadah should be comprehended and understood by everyone who was there. And then he says, Umashin niskan lashona habo b'nei chorin ve'eno targum. So he answers our question and asks questions. Well, what about the last bit? Why is that in Hebrew and not in Aramaic? Kamo sha'a kol ha'charuzo, right, apart from all the rest of this section. Levish niskan b'bovel, because he's saying, says the Ravia, Lachma Anya was composed in Talmudic times in Babylon. Uloshonom hoya aromis, and that was their language. And so, since it was the vernacular at that time, the non-Jews round about them would have understood Aramaic. The Yomru, the Jews are wanting to leave, they're wanting to go out of our land, and they would perhaps thereby be endangered. So he wants to suggest that perhaps that's why Lashon Habor, those two words, were put in Hebrew rather than Aramaic. It's a bit of a difficult explanation to accept because there's not much difference between Lashon Habor and Lishon. If a person speaks Aramaic, they probably would understand other Semitic languages as well, and it's not very different to difficult. But nevertheless, that's the suggestion the Ravi wants to say, is that these last two words were put in Hebrew, perhaps so that other people wouldn't understand the exact meaning of that particular phrase. So that's his suggestion. Where do we find Lachma Anya? So it's not in the Mishnah and the Gemara. The first reference, and this is, as a result of the Cairo Geniza, which we've now had, since the beginning of the 20th century, a huge, rich reservoir of writings of the Gaonim and many examples of Gaonic literature. And we now know that the first reference to Lachma Anya is in the writings of one of the Gaonim called Ramatatia Gaon. He served as a Gaon in Babylon from 860 to 869, and he writes the following. Our practice is saying, whoever is hungry, let him come in and eat. This was the old custom of our forebears. They would raise up their tables. They had little tables beside by each participant rather than a large dining room table. So they would lift up the tables. They wouldn't close their doors. And they would say, anyone who's hungry, let him come and eat. And that was so that any needy Jew could come and hear the invitation and come in and join them. And this was a very good thing to do. So it was an open invitation to a needy Jew. However, it says, we find that we're living in neighborhoods where there are more Gentiles than Jews. So what do? We make sure that any Jew who is in need has his needs provided for well before Pesach, so they shouldn't have to, start running from one place to another to find somewhere at the last minute to have their Seder. And so he says it's a relic of earlier times where this was a genuine invitation, that at the beginning of the Seder, before they would begin, they would make this announcement, anyone who's hungry, come, and just like, I suppose, analogously, there are people that know you go to the Kotel on a Friday night, in the times were before COVID, obviously, and stand around and you get an invitation for a Friday night meal from somebody. It could be done. And so people would know they could find their Seder invitation in the area of Ramatatia Gaon, where they were living, and that was used to be the practice. However, now it's no longer the case because he says we're living more amongst Gentiles. So we recite it as a reminder of what used to happen and to remind us of the earlier practice. And so it's a reminder of the old practice. We lift the table and recite Lachma Anya. So this was the original practice. However, let's just jump 2 pages there. And Ramatatia is referring to an old Talmudic practice when he says here that we invite people to come and join us. And in fact, it's a practice that's mentioned in the Gemara, in the Masechta, in the Bavli in Tainis. And he says that the practice of Rav Huna, Kachoya Korach Rifta. So Rav Huna says whenever he would eat bread, So what did he do? Anyone who's in need, let him come in and eat. And so we see stage one of the composition of Holachmia is simply a phrase from Ramatat Yagom that just was Kol Dichvin Yetze V'Yechol. That was the origin of Holachma, that phrase Kol Dichvin Yetze V'Yechol that was said at the beginning of the Haggadah before they went much further. So that was stage one. Then we move forward. Further parts are added during the Gaonic period. And so, for example, Rav Sadia Gaon, who is the Gaon in 892 to 942, one of the major figures in the Gaonic period. So his Haggadah has the phrase, Hoshata hocha lishnod ba'ara de Yisrael. Hoshata avdei lishona habot b'nei chorin. Kol dichvin yetz v'yechol, kol ditzrich yetz v'yifsach. So you see, this is his version. Slightly different order to what we have. He's starting with saying, this year we are here. Next year we will be in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year we will be free. Whoever is hungry, let him come in and eat. Whoever is needy, let him come in and celebrate Pesach. And so you see that we've now added to Lachma Anya. We've added the phrase that we are here in Babylon. Next year we hope to be in the land of Israel. This year we are slaves. Next year we hope to be free. And then the phrase Kol ditzrich yetze v'yechel, Kol difsich yetze v'yiftzach. Now we can see straight away in this passage of Reb Sadia Gaon an explanation and answer one of our earlier questions. You can see that in its context they have added to the phrase Kol ditzrich yetze v'yechel, whoever is hungry let him come and eat, Kol difsich yetze v'yitzchak, is nothing to do with the Passover offering in Pesach in temple times. All it means is whoever would like to come and celebrate Pesach. Kol ditzrich is simply referring to celebrate Pesach, nothing to do with the Korban Pesach. And of course, you can also see we've answered our question about the anomaly of the Hebrew at the end. Look in the earliest sources, it is completely in Aramaic. Sadia Gaon, that we've just seen, has the whole of the Holachma of his time completely in Aramaic. Let's look at the Rambam, Maimonides' version, just below, who has the version which corresponds almost to our version today. He starts by saying, Bibehilu yotzanu Mitzrayim, in haste we left Egypt. Then he puts it in the order that we have it. Lachma Anya de'achola abasana ba'ara de Mitzrayim. This is the bread of affliction which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Called Tikvin de'se v'yechol de'kidis re'se v'yifsach. Whoever is hungry to come and eat. Whoever is needed to come and celebrate in Pesach. Hoshata hocha l'shata da'asya ba'ara d'Yisrael. This year we're here, next year in the land of Israel. Hoshata hocha avdei l'shata da'asya b'nei chori. So next year we'll be slaves. They will be free. And so you can see the Rambam's version, it's all in Hebrew. It's all in Aramaic. It's not in Hebrew at all. And so, as I say, the question as to why some of it is in Hebrew, that's happened at a later stage. Why should that be? Well, a copyist might have put it in Hebrew, and it stuck, and it also matches the end of the Haggadah, the very end of the formal Haggadah, where you have Lashon Haba. And so it could be that, it was just nice to have a matching beginning and ending. Lashon Haba, Lashon Haba. So Lashon Haba ba'arat Yisrael, Lashon Haba b'Yerushalayim. And so that's perhaps how it stuck. But there's no, it would seem, if you look at it historically, no profound significance. Oh, we're putting this bit in Hebrew so that other people shouldn't understand. So now it comes to a significant question. If then the Lachma Anya wasn't composed in the time of the Talmud, but rather composed later on in Babylon, why is it in Aramaic? The language they spoke then was Arabic, okay? The Gaonim spoke Arabic, and some of their writings are in Arabic. However, they also composed extensively in Aramaic as well. It was like a second Lashon HaKodesh for them. And so there are a number of examples, and you know some of them. So the Shiltot, you may or may not know, or Achagon, is composed in Aramaic, but I'm sure you know the Yom Purkom prayer from the Shabbos service, the prayer which includes a prayer on behalf of the leaders of the community, the Rabbonim, etc. And then a number of other prayers, for example, those of you familiar with Salichas. Well, no, there are sections that are in Aramaic from the time of the Gaonim, Lachma Anya, etc. And so Aramaic prayers were composed often quite extensively by the Gaonim. And so what you therefore have, and so the Gaonim composed a prayer of hope to be said at the beginning of the Seder. We're celebrating our Seder here. Please God, we hope to celebrate our Seder in a completely redeemed land of Israel. Okay, so that's why it's in Aramaic and a sort of an opening invocation. Now let's examine another puzzle. The version's opening phrase, where it says, Lachma Anya, the Achola Avosana Ba'ara de Mitzrayim. This is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Well, did they eat matzah in Egypt as slaves? This is an interesting question. Now, there is a tradition quoted in the name of the Ibn Ezra. He doesn't say it himself, but the Orchos Chaim quotes an authority who lived after the time of the Ibn Ezra, who says, why is matzah called lechem oni? So Rabbi Yosef HaOzavi said in the name of Ibn Ezra, he says Ibn Ezra was held captive in India, and he was given matzah and never any chametz, and for the reason that matzah is not digested quickly, a small amount is sufficient, and the Egyptians did the same thing to Israel. And so matzah, it is argued, is a slave food. Ibn Ezra knew that from experience, and for that reason, he's then the matzah was being given to them, and in that way, that's why the phrase is used. Our ancestors had it in the land of Egypt. It was slave food, well, the original fast food, if you like. It was something that could be made quickly, given to slaves with a minimum. They could get back to their work very quickly, and it was not digested quickly. Many people suffer from indigestion from eating matzahs, and so a small amount is sufficient. So that's the suggestion that's made in the name of the Ibn Ezra, as yes, genuinely, that this is the bread of affliction our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. However, there are others who dispute that. First of all, we have no record that Ibn Ezra ever visited Egypt, and certainly not held captive there. So it could be that Ibn Ezra, if he is stating this passage, is referring not to himself, but someone else. But the Maharal asks a famous question. The Maharal in his work, Gevuras Hashem on the Seder, he says, V'heim devarim shiyachish hakosov. It is contradicted by the verses, Va'emes, and the truth is we know what happened. Kilonim soba shum makom. We don't find anywhere. Lo b'kosov, not in scripture. Lo b'mishnah, not in the Mishnah. Lo b'talmud, or in the Talmud. Shahamitzrim hoyu machinim es Yisrael matzah. We don't find that they fed them matzah to eat. V'adarabah, on the contrary, B'sifri Omru, Parshas Baloischa, Zacharnu es hadoga, Ashenu chabu Mitzrayim chino. The pasuk itself says, we remember, that this right says, what we ate in Egypt, we remember the fish, and so on and so forth. They don't say we remember the matzah. And so the matzah says, I don't understand. And so he goes on to say that this language is not precise. When it says Lachma Anya, the Achol Avosana Ba'aret, it's not expressed precisely. He says there the matzah when they left Egypt. Well, in the land of Egypt, could be, he says, that part of the journey, they were still in the environs of Egypt. He says that the sort of greater Egypt. But he says emphatically, he says, the Gevuras Hashem, Abol ein inyan hamatzah zeicher rak lecherus. And so the Maharal wants to argue matzah is only a symbol of freedom. Now, of course, you're more possibly familiar with other interpretations of Lachma Anya, the Abarbanel, that you have, it's both slavery and freedom, and it's giving this dialectic that we have. But as far as the Maharal is concerned, no. that the phrase that Lachma Anya Mitzrayim can't be understood literally. They ate it as slave food in the land of Egypt. That doesn't make sense at all. He says no, matzah was only eaten at the later stage. There is, though, another possibility. I mean, it's not beyond the realm that it was a slave food. I mean, there is a reference in the Sifri where it says Rabbi Shimon Omer. He says, "Lama nikra lechem oini." Why do we call it lechem oini? Al shem she'inui, because of their persecution. It's anav Mitzrayim. They were persecuted in Egypt, and so the matzah represents the bread of persecution. So it could be that was a quick food, and it's not. And when the Israelites are recalling it, they're recalling obviously the nicer things that they enjoyed. There were times when they had fish, etc. But it could be that their staple was matzah. That's a possibility. But I want to suggest an alternative direction for our understanding. So again, going back to the sources, where is the first reference to Lachma Anya? Lachma Anya, say, oh, Lachma Anya. Where do we find that phrase first referred to? It's an Aramaic phrase, but where does it first occur? It occurs in a translation of a verse in Chumash. And lechem only does not appear in the passages regarding the Exodus and Shemos. It appears in the recapitulation in Devarim, where the pasuk says, "Lo sochal olov chometz," you shall not eat leaven with it. Shivas yomim tochal olov matzos lechem oini. For 7 days you should eat matzos, the bread of affliction. Ki b'chipozon, for in haste, yotzasem Eretz Yisrael, you left the land in Egypt, Mantiska, you should remember it all the days of your life. And so, lechem oni is referred to in this pasuk in Devarim. We now look at the Targum of Yonasan min Uziel of this phrase. Lo sichlon al pischa chamio shavua yomin tuchlin lishma pote lachmo anyo. And so lechem oni is translated in the Targum Yonasan as lachmo anyo. So this is the first reference to the phrase lachmo anyo. It's occurring in this translation of lechem oni in the Targum Yonasan of this pasuk in Re'eh. Now that is in the context of b'chipozon. Etit b'chipozon in haste. Now when did that chipozon, that haste, start? When did it start? So we are told in Shemos, when the instructions were given for the first Seder, v'kocha tochlu oso, this is how you should eat it. Mosnechem chagorim, your loins girded, nalechem beraglechem, your shoes on your feet, makelchem b'yetchem, your staff in your hand, v'achaltem oso b'chipozon, and you should eat that korban Pesach in haste. Pesach ul Hashem, it's a Passover sacrifice to God. And so the chipozon was that first Seder meal, which was Pesach and matzah and maror. They had, they had the Passover lamb together with matzah and bitter herbs. But that's where the chipozon was. And the Shilte Shiboni Haleket is Tzedakah ben Avram Anav of Rome of the 13th century. He explains, in his view, the Lachma Anya serves as an educational purpose. And so here's an explanation called Disrach Yetzav of Yivsach, everyone who's needed to come in and celebrate Pesach. He mentions that Rabbeinu Yeshaya wanted to exclude this passage. Lo gir soleh, she'lo lo Pesach ato. We don't have a Passover lamb today, so we should exclude this passage if you were to understand it as referring to the Korban Pesach. He said, and even if we would have had a Passover lamb today, and you wouldn't be of any benefit to have a new guest come in, because you only could eat the Passover lamb if you had previously reserved before it was slaughtered. He said, and he didn't want to put it in his version of Haggadah. However, Rabbi Yomim, later on, Vanessa, he says, my brother, and Shibolech often quotes his brother, because of the chashash, you don't have to worry that you have to take it out. Salkale. And even though it's now not the time when we're sitting down to the Seder of the Korban Pesach, he says, and this is his principle, Loshan ha-Haggadah mesuderes al yesod hapsukim. He says our Haggadah is based on the verses of what happened at the time of the original Seder. They were required to take a lamb for each household, etc. If the household was too small for a lamb, then they would take someone else to join in them, etc. They would ensure that they would have guests so that they could have the Korban Pesach as a group of sufficient size to eat it, and they would invite people to join them for that very purpose. And so they would obviously have extended invitations before the lamb was being slaughtered to ensure that they would have the right size and kind of group. And that was done obviously before the lamb was slaughtered. And says the Shibbolei Haleket. So our mentioning of this in Lachma Anya is simply a reminder of what used to happen historically. That at that Seder in Egypt, they had that invitation, and when they ate their matzah in Egypt together with the Korban Pesach, this was, we're reminding ourselves as to what happened. So thus, according to the Shibbolei Haleket, the reference would say this is the Lachma Anya under Mitzrayim, which our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt, not as slaves, but rather at the Seder. So Pesach Mitzrayim, which they were told to eat with, dressed, ready to rush out with the matzah and the morah and the Korban Pesach, that's the Seder that we ate in Egypt with matzah. And so rather than trying to work out, did they not have matzah rations as slaves, very clearly, it was the Seder in Mitzrayim that it is being referred to here. So that's one explanation which we have from the Shibbolei Haleket. The second explanation, which is the most straightforward answer, given in the Yemeni Haggadah, which the Maharal of Prague alludes to, we hadn't seen the Yemeni Haggadah, he said they just have a phrase, the Achola Avosana, the Nafaku Me'aradim Mitzrayim. This is the bread of affliction our ancestors ate when they left the land of Egypt. And so all problems are solved. We don't have to worry about how could they have eaten the matzah regions, the bread, it's referring to slavery. No. This is the matzah they ate when they left the land of Egypt. And therefore it coincides exactly with what Rabbi Gamliel is saying in his explanation when we have to, why do we eat it? And so we've seen some explanations of the historical development of Lachma Anya and how we would understand it. Of course, that doesn't stop us wanting to understand Lachma Anya in a broader sense, and using it and understanding it symbolically to represent, as Rabbi Sachs puts very beautifully, from affliction to affection. He quotes Primo Levi that what's the indicator of someone who's free? He's able to share his bread. And so, of course, there are many beautiful moral ideas, ethical ideas that we can learn out of Lachma Anya once you have a text already in place. But to explore the origins of how the text came about, this is what I've tried to show you in my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dayan Binstock. Appreciate it. And what I have to say, I thought I knew Lachma Anya. Having listened to the shir, I can definitely say with total conviction that I was at best a novice. So really, thank you very much. Some of those Makoros, those sources, just absolutely fascinating. Not only for those listening, but for rabbis as well. So thank you very much. And we really appreciate your time. And of course, we wish you a good Pesach, a Chag, kosher v'sameach. Talking about kosher, we are very pleased to welcome Rabbi Conway. Rabbi Conway is the director of the KLBD. I'm sure most Pesachs are very busy, Rabbi Conway, but this year and probably last year are more busy than most. So again, we appreciate your time. And it's beautiful to have this Matmid evening with the United Synagogue, of course, focusing on the learning before Pesach to make sure we can understand Pesach a little bit better. I'm very much looking forward to this, Rabbi Conway. I can't tell you how many questions we get in the rabbinate. Why does this need a hechsher? Why does this need a hechsher, etc.? People are very connected to Pesach. they see what their ancestors, well, to be often what their mothers did and what their grandmothers did, etc. And it goes in the family. The sensitivity towards kashrus on Pesach is thank God phenomenal, and it's people like organizations like KLBD and people like you who make sure that those standards are upheld and kept. So thank you very much. We're looking forward to your presentation about why is this food different, issues, challenges and situations in products on Pesach. Over to you, Rabbi Conway.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Fine, for your generous introduction. I've entitled this talk, as you hear, Kasha LePesach, Ma Nishtana HaMaichal Hazeh. Why is this food different just because it's got a Pesach label on it? Is it really any different to what we're having throughout the year? Why is it that we really go so crazy? Just seen the queues outside Kosher Kingdom. Why is it that we make such a extraordinary business about our food on Pesach? So here's a slide, how not to make Pesach. Some people at this time of year would like to take this route, just blow up the whole house and start again, rebuilding the houses made out of matzah, all these extraordinary stringencies which are not particular about during the year. And it is essentially because if you go back to the verses of the Chumash in Parashas Bo, you see that the mitzvahs and the prohibitions are repeated over and over again, and they are very particularly stringent. There are no less than 3 mitzvahs aseh and 5 mitzvahs lo aseh. Not to eat chometz, not to own chometz, not to even eat mixtures of chometz. Chometz should not be seen in your possession, should not be found in your possession. You're not even allowed to own any chometz. Most of these do not apply to the other kashrus rules and regulations. And that is why we're extremely stringent. Here's a classic picture of people checking their house for Pesach, taking down the curtains, checking all the books and the bookshelves, even though in halacha it says that crumbs are automatically annulled. It's only large pieces of biscuits and cake which we're concerned about, because maybe somebody will say a nice biscuit, he eats it during the year and he'll eat it without thinking about it. Nonetheless, we are stringent to wash the chairs as being done in this diagram, to check the shelves and the books, even to scrape the walls, it says in Shulchan Aruch, actually. Nergu legarer hakasolim bakisois. The minhag is that we scrape the walls and the chairs. And even though this is extreme, yesh lehem al mashi yismochu, they have on what to rely. There is a source for this. And I applied to them the phrase, say the early commentaries, Yisrael kadoshim heim, the Jewish people are a holy people, and they bend over backwards to keep all the mitzvahs. Amech kulam tzadikim, I applied to them. They're righteous people, and they're holy people, and they're particular with the laws of Pesach and the laws of Chometz in the most detailed way. Perhaps I should just mention here that one of the key reasons is that there is a very stringent punishment for the most severe prohibitions of the Torah, and that is called kores, excision. That's how we translate it. We don't know so precisely what it means. Cutting off of the soul, God forbid. And it doesn't apply to any kashrut mitzvahs, to eating mitzvahs, with the exception of 3. And in all those 3, we're very, very stringent. So one is not to consume any blood. And we know how particular we are to salt all our meat, to roast the liver, because we need to get rid of every last drop of blood, even to check the eggs for any drop of blood. Why are we so particular about blood? Because it's an isur kores. There's a prohibition for which the punishment is kores. The second is the isur, the prohibition of eating chelev, the fats which are found predominantly in the hindquarters. And we know that the minhag goes back, not just in England, but across Europe, indeed in America as well. In most places in the world, there's been a minhag for centuries not to have the hindquarter, because it's so difficult to porge and because the prohibition is so serious. And the third one is not to eat chametz on Pesach. So when we put it in that kind of context, we get a better understanding why we're so particular not to eat chametz. What is chametz? I'm showing a slide here, 5 species of grain: wheat, barley, oats, rye, spelt. All these things are found quite commonly in years gone by. When did one come across spelt, if not in a spelling test? But now it's a common form of grain, and all these grains and derivatives of grains, as we shall see, create various ingredients which are utilized in the food chain today. And for Ashkenazim, it's not only the 5 types of grain, it's also kitnios, peas, beans, pulses. This is an ancient custom. Some say it's a ruling. We don't even know that. We know it's over 1,000 years old, that Ashkenazim don't eat kitnios on Pesach. And all sorts of reasons are suggested for that. And I'm showing here a slide from the Flour Advisory Bureau, which I picked up when I was doing a kashrut inspection at a mill. And it's most interesting that the origin of the, as I say, custom or law not to eat kitnios is lost, you might say, in the mists of antiquity. Some say because these type of pulses are grown adjacent to the species of grain, and therefore they can easily get mixed in and confused. Some say that when you cook them up like a porridge, they form very similar dishes, and people won't distinguish between one and other. Some suggest because they share the same sacks and baskets. Some say it's because you make flour with peas and beans. And most interesting, I'm showing this slide, which sadly you probably can't see, of this leaflet, this brochure from the Flour Advisory Council, which says bread is one of the oldest foods known to man and has been a staple food for over 5,000 years. That's exactly what we say. Since the time of Adam Harishon, Adam, who was given the curse, you'll eat bread by the sweat of your brow. But bread today is very different from the bread people were eating 5,000 years ago. And it goes on to say that the ancient Egyptians were the first to discover yeast and produce risen loaves. So it may be, there's a special reason why we avoid chometz and eat only matzah on Pesach, because according to the Flour Advisory Bureau, this was particularly the Egyptians who used to raise their loaves through means of fermentation and yeast. But I wanted to highlight the next sentence. In addition to wheat and rye, bread was made from oats, barley, grass seeds, and in times of shortage and famine, even peas and beans. So the Flour Advisory Bureau seems to side with those halachic views that the reason we avoid kitnios is because people used to make bread from peas and beans and similar types of things. The most important food, of course, on Pesach is matzah. And I'm showing here a fascinating slide, the flour and bread regulations, government regulations, revisited 1998, where it mentions that flour used for matzos are an exception in English law, because all other flour has been fortified by means of various additional minerals and vitamins, and we are not allowed to have any additives whatsoever in our flour, and therefore actually matzahs, together interestingly with communion wafers, lahavdil, matzahs are a special exception in law that they don't need to have any additives added to them. So we use a special kind of matzah. Indeed, we have a special mill, because in the normal milling process, the wheat is softened by being sprayed by water because it's very, very hard and harsh and difficult to mill. So we have our own mill, Kosher Pesach mill, for example, for Rakuzans, they have their own mill, dedicated only to the use of Passover flour. You would love to see the next slides, which are a picture of yours truly out in the field together with Dayanim of the Beis Din, because when we produce the Shemura matzah for Rakuzans, we actually go out to the fields, jump on the combine harvester, and actually let down the cutters l'shem matzahs mitzvah, for the purposes of the mitzvah. You know that every object of a mitzvah, whether it's a Sefer Torah, mezuzah, tzitzis, have to be made specifically for the mitzvah. You can't just take a roll of string and attach them and tie the knots to your four-cornered garment to make tzitzis. The tzitzis themselves are combed and twisted, and the threads are made specifically. They're imbued with the holiness of the mitzvah by being made for the purpose of the mitzvah. One of the meanings of Shemura matzah, to do the mitzvah of eating matzah on Seder night, is that it's been made specifically for the mitzvah. So many people will be amazed to discover that the rabbis go out to the fields and aid in cutting the wheat. We don't do it anymore with a scythe. That might take rather a long time. But we go on the combine harvester. This year, with COVID, the drivers of the combines were reluctant to let rabbis share the confines of their cab. And this was a shaila, an issue for the Dayanim to consider, which while they were pondering it, the owner of the fields, the farmer, the owner of the wheat, said, we've done this for many years. I know how important this procedure is for you. So I'm prepared. I don't want a whole host of rabbis, but if one rabbi comes with me, I'll let the regular drivers off for the afternoon and I will drive the combine myself. And I'm happy. You know, you'll have your COVID test and you wear a mask, etc., etc. And we succeeded in doing this year as well, the cutting of the wheat for the purposes of the mitzvah. Got some lovely slides here. I've just shown one of Dayan Ivan. He should be well and healthy, have a complete recovery. Saying, will you stop playing with that camera and come up here on the combine because it's your turn. Now, after giving you some insight as to what's involved in just preparing matzahs for Pesach, I haven't mentioned in the factory, of course, in Rakuzans or any other matzah factory, the mashgichim who check to ensure that the flour and water have not been in contact more than 18 minutes before they get baked. And any excess dough which is left on the conveyors or on the cutters has to be cleaned. And it's a very obviously exacting procedure. Gives you some insight as to why we would expect matzah to be a lot more expensive. Fortunately, with the supermarkets vying against one another and trying to encourage people to come and shop with them with various loss leaders, matzah is usually sold as a loss leader. I believe it's sold in the shops cheaper than the manufacturers is actually selling it to the supermarkets. The next key food, obviously on Pesach, is wine. And my next set of slides highlights how complex it is to produce wine, because unlike all other foods and drinks where you need an inspector or supervisor to check that the ingredients and the sub-ingredients are used are the proper ones expected, he doesn't have to do the manufacture himself. He doesn't have to do the production, the processing himself. Whereas when you make wine, kosher wine can only be handled by Jewish people. And therefore that means from the very beginning, the tipping of the lorries which come in with the grapes, and they tip the lorry so that all the wine and the grapes will fall down into the vat. From that point, the inspectors, the rabbis, actually I've got a set of slides here which shows a group of young ladies one year producing our sherry in Jerez in Spain. We couldn't get our regular group of young men who'd gone back to yeshiva, but the girls were still on holiday, so we did a group of girls. Doesn't have to be men, doesn't have to be rabbis. And some great slides, such a shame. Another occasion, please God, we'll get the equipment working properly. But from the tipping of the wine, the operating of the presses, the operating of the filters, the taking of the samples, everything has to be done by Jewish people. And therefore you need a team of 15 people, maybe 20 people, to operate the presses and to make sure the whole process from beginning to end, the wine is never handled or moved in any way by non-Jews, all done by Jewish people. And if, as a result, the wine, a kosher wine, is a few pounds more expensive than the regular bottle, to me, it just shows how cheap the kosher products actually are. Because you're producing this product for a very small percentage of the population. It's not going out to hundreds of thousands of people, probably not even to tens of thousands, going out to a few thousand. And we've put so much work into it and so many people have been involved, it gives you some understanding when you see what's involved of why the prices, it's not surprising to find that they're a little higher. Key area of what I want to talk about, and we'll get all these wine slides amiss, is the derivatives of all these products. I have a slide here which talks about glucose syrup. Glucose syrup is to be found in many, many products in the larder. And there are derivatives from glucose syrup as well. Now, glucose syrup for many, many years has been made predominantly from wheat. You ferment the wheat in a warm solution with various enzymes, and you produce glucose from this. From glucose, you produce caramel, vitamin C, ascorbic acid, xanthan gum, sorbitol, gluconic acid, fumaric acid, many, many different ingredients. And part of the reason that many basic products, like, let's say, tinned fruit, regular tinned fruit is not acceptable on Pesach, is because almost all these products have a preservative added, vitamin C or ascorbic acid. If you have pure apple juice, it usually says, when you look in the small print, pure apple juice, yes, but with added vitamin C. Tinned fruit, but with some ascorbic acid. Tinned or tomato paste with ascorbic acid. And that ascorbic acid today is very, very often, very commonly of chometz origin, of wheat origin. Actually, some years ago, it was mainly of maize origin, and that made life a lot easier. Toothpaste, for example, we used to allow in the London Basin all toothpaste. There is an issue of the ingredient sorbitol, which I mentioned, which is made from glucose. But since glucose is primarily, in those years, was made from maize, and it was only a question of kitnius, there was room to be lenient. People used to think that the London Basin has moved to the right and has become more stringent. I used to like to respond in this area that actually it was the EC moving to the left, because the EC was giving subsidies to farmers to encourage them to grow wheat, which meant that wheat was a much cheaper raw material, and glucose, instead of being made from maize, became made from wheat, which was a big issue for us. So at least one good thing perhaps has come out of Brexit, that maybe we will be able to have ingredients from sources that we want them to come from. But at the moment, most glucose comes from wheat. And one of the key ingredients from glucose is caramel. Now, if you wonder what's the difference between the Pesach Coca-Cola and the regular Coca-Cola, it looks exactly the same label, same bottle, same top. But in actual fact, it's a completely different product. One of the first ingredients after the water and the sugar, the first ingredient of Coke is caramel. And the caramel concentrate is made in Ireland. The London Basin was very involved, together with the OU and Rav Lando from Bnei Barak, in giving the hechsher to the Pesach Coke. The first thing we had to do is ensure we had a source of kosher Pesach caramel. And the caramel, which was made normally, was chometz caramel from wheat origin. So they had to make a special caramel for the Coca-Cola, still do to this day, from invert sugar. We used to send mashgichim to the Irish sugar factory to kasher out the equipment in which they made the invert sugar, and to kasher out the lorry, because the lorry used to take this hot caramel, which was chometzdik, and transport it from one factory to another. We kashered out the actual tanker with boiling water. We make a special production with a mashgiach, with an inspector, of invert sugar, and that's taken to the caramel factory. I think about a week in the caramel factory. After the very intense cleaning process of the filters, eventually they bought special filters which they kept for Pesach, because cleaning them was such a huge problem. And kashering and changing the boiler water because of the steam and the halachas of the boiler water, which has done the actual cooking and which is reused, has to be emptied and refilled. And then eventually they make the caramel, which fortunately was transported from South Island, from Cork, up till the factory near Dublin in Drogheda. Fortunately, they used the same lorries, so we didn't need to kasher another set of lorries. And we get this caramel to our factory, the Coca-Cola factory, near Dublin. And there, I think there's about a 3-week production of Sprite and 7-Up and all the various drinks, and including, of course, Coke and Diet Coke and all the various different varieties. And as I say, the big issue, apart from checking all the flavors, which, by the way, come from many different factories, people who want to keep the secrets of their trade do not have all the ingredients made in one factory. So there's a lot of work for kashrus agencies across the world, indeed, producing all the different ingredients which go into the Coke and go into the flavor for Coke. We don't know the secrets because it's all made across the world in different factories by different kashrus authorities. But one day all the rabbis will get together for a conference and we'll all talk about what we do for Coca-Cola. Chas v'sholom, God forbid, it's all strictly confidential. But that gives you some sort of insight. So much work goes into it. But why, in fact, is the price not so different to what a regular 1 liter, 1.5 liter bottle of Coke costs? Is because they're producing the concentrate which goes to Israel. In Israel, it gets bottled. They add the sugar, they add the water, they add the fizz. I always say we're better to get the fizz than B'nai Barak in Israel. And when you make Coke for Israel, you're making it for 6 million people. You're making it for an entire country. You're not even making it for an entire country for a week. You're making it for an entire country probably for a minimum of 2 weeks beforehand and afterwards to make sure that there's plenty of Coke on the shelves, which is kosher LePesach. In which case, the fact that you spent a few days kashering equipment and kashering factories and mashkichim, the cost of that is negligible in the overall context that you're producing millions and millions and millions of bottles. But when we produce a local product, that's why things become so expensive, because the logistics have to be or can only be shared amongst a limited number of people. We don't have a lot of time, but I'd just like to highlight perhaps one or two other areas. When you come on to commercial production of, let's say, Coca-Cola, people perhaps understand why it's very complex, got a lot of ingredients. A flavor can have 40 sub-ingredients, and we're going to be very particular as the halachis use the expression mishum chumra de chometz, because of the stringency of chometz, which I talked about earlier. We understand why these things are very complex and they need a special production and they need to be made specifically for Pesach. But when you talk about, Rabbi, simple things like tea or sugar or coffee, do we really need to get these supervised? So I've got a wonderful slide here, which actually is a tea card. Do you remember the days when Brook Bond used to have a card in with the tea? And you could learn all sorts of interesting things. And here's a series about tea, the language of tea, a series of 12, number 11. A shame you can't see it on the screen. It's actually a card which was sent to me, gosh, more years than I need to care to remember. Well, probably 30 or 35 more years ago, from my father-in-law, Zichrono Livrocha. I was learning in a kollel in Amsterdam at the time. He was in London. He was a Dayan on the London Bet Din. And I want to show you the way a Talmid Chacham, a scholar, a Dayan, reads a tea card. He wrote on this tea card, it's headed Smuggling Tea to Britain, and he wrote, Ayin Sharid Shuva, Simon Tofnon Gimel, Sifkotten Gimel. Have a look in the Shulchan Aruch, one of the commentaries there by one of the great halachis from about 200-300 years ago. And he writes, Ayin Shvus Yaakov. The Shvus Yaakov, one of the early halachis, writes, Shekosav betei, about tea. Shamati sherabim pershim. I've heard that many people avoid tea on Pesach. Birchas toiv tovo aleim. And they're quite right to do so. Why? Shamati sherabim pershim. Because there is a problem of swindlers, or a possibility of swindlers, who use tea, and then they dry it and reuse it, or they sell it. Reuse tea. And maybe it was used the first time with chometz. And I know this sounds ridiculous, but he says, and so I've heard from many reliable people. And therefore, a person who's careful should avoid drinking tea, using tea on Pesach. There's that phrase again, because on Pesach, one needs to be particularly careful, particularly stringent. Well, it sounds absolutely ridiculous. They were reusing tea, drying it and selling it. How did they do that, for goodness sake? Well, you can just see a picture of all the little tea bags hanging on the line. It hadn't even invented tea bags yet. So how did they do this? Is it really true? Could it be such a thing? So look at this card from the Brook Bond series of tea number 11. Until the late 18th century, heavy taxes were imposed on tea in Britain. And so smuggling developed into a highly profitable and sophisticated enterprise. We remember learning about that in the school, I'm sure, the Boston Tea Party and such like, because of the heavy taxes imposed on tea. Dutch merchant ships would bring tea across the channel and anchor off the English coast. Small local craft took it ashore, and underground passages leading from caves to remote inland lanes provided the start to a nationwide distribution network. Rogue dealers were also common, passing off used tea, which has been treated and dried or mixed with fillers such as dried licorice leaves. It was not unknown for animal dung to be used. So we see that the Shvus Yaakov knew what he was talking about, and it's corroborated by the Brook Bond series of tea, card number 11, that they used to reuse tea somehow or other. Don't go away from this talk saying Rabbi Conway said we can't use tea on Pesach because they add animal dung. Obviously, the problems have changed, thank God, since that time. But a typical problem nowadays is that there are varieties of tea, which if we didn't buy tea, which has been specifically checked and approved and has a label on, people would assume all tea is the same. Assam, Darjeeling, green, black, Earl Grey, it's all different types of tea, is it not? I highlight in my next couple of slides how complex the Earl Grey tea is. I show a tea bag from a well-known make, fine tea from China and India, scented with bergamot. And because we were asked to kosher certify this product, we have a copy of the list of ingredients that go into it, and particularly what's called the camouflaged bergamot flavor granules. It's a whole list here. I don't show it all because it's highly confidential. But what's so fascinating is how many different ingredients go in there, and in particular, major ingredients, modified starch and glucose solids. Starch could be chometz. The glucose solids, as I mentioned before, glucose is almost certainly chometz nowadays. I would say 98% likely to be chometz. If you have regular Earl Grey tea, you'd think it's just tea, but in fact, it is chometz on Pesach. I probably shouldn't go too much over time. You'll forgive me not talking about sugar in my next series of slides. I'll just tell you that there are people who think, and there was once a very aggressive anti-Based-in article in the Jewish media. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Very unusual. And claiming that sugar, certifying sugar for Pesach is a modern stringency. I was able to write back to the paper, and they did at least print my letter, to say that it's hardly a stringency, it might be, but it's hardly a modern stringency, because Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah, written by Ramosha Isserles, who lived 1530 to 1572, quotes an earlier source, the Trumas Hadeshen, who lived 1390 to 1460. So we're talking about the 15th century. And he was of the opinion that you may not buy sugar on Pesach unless it's been made under supervision. The problem in those days was its adulteration with flour. Icing sugar is still adulterated, if you can use that expression. It uses a free flow agent of corn flour. And let me just go back, even though you can't see these slides, but they are my notes effectively. And sugar today is produced by affination, melting, carbonatation, filtration, decolorization, evaporation, crystallization, centrifuging, etc., etc. And there are many, many processing aids which are used along the way: antifoams, flocculants, pan-aids, etc., etc. I show later in this talk, and I'm going to bring things to a close now. Got some slides about the complexity of spices and what unexpected things are added to them, and how a newspaper article from a few years ago, 11 food companies, including Sainsbury's, Safeway, Asda, and Tesco, major supermarket chains, were being prosecuted over adulteration of pure orange juice with water, sugar, and chemical additives. One of the additives being corn syrup, which was widely used. We're talking about reputable companies, even though in halacha you're entitled to rely on a reputable company. But we'd hope that, we have a scandal every few years, whether it's horse meat or something else, but hopefully it's not too often. But when it comes to Pesach, the halacha advises us and encourages us to take, if you're going to have processed products, and let's always remind ourselves that you don't need processed products. You need 4 cups of wine, but you don't need 4 cups of Coke. And you don't need to have coffee, and you don't need to have tea. But meat and chicken and vegetables and fruit and all the good things are actually the same price as they are throughout the year. But it's most interesting to see, to our attention, that even something which is sold as a pure orange juice may not necessarily be 100% pure. I conclude my talk by just highlighting that through a lot of work of KLBD over recent years, we now have Tate & Lyle sugar, granulated sugar, caster sugar, preserving sugar, demerara sugar, all kosher Pesach throughout the year. They have a KLBD P. You can buy them in any supermarket. They're the same price and they're the same product, and they're kosher LePesach the whole year. I can't say the same for every other brand, but Tate & Lyle is the regular sugar is fine. Coffee, Nescafe, Go Blend, and the decaffeinated, even though decaffeination can be a problem with use of ethyl alcohol, which can be of grain origin. But coffee, Nescafe coffee, both the original and the original decaffeinated, what we call the red label, and the Go Blend and the blue label decaffeinated, again, a kosher LePesach. We haven't convinced Nestle yet to put a KLBD on the packaging, but it is kosher certified, visits by a rabbi, tied up with a legal contract, and kosher LePesach throughout the year, as is Yorkshire tea, as is Saxa salt. So we've come to a stage where, yes, there are lots of issues and lots of problems and complexities, but we've tried to make life as easy as possible, at least when it comes to the regular staple products. One final slide, and then I don't know if anybody is still listening to me, but if you are, thank you so much. One final slide, which is, the question is, why are Pesach products so expensive? And people don't realize that the main reason, nothing to do with mashkichim, not even to do with cleaning, not even to do with having extra filters which you keep in the loft and in the warehouse. Primarily, Pesach products are so expensive because of the cost of the raw materials. So if you wonder why a cake is £10 when the equivalent thing during the year would be £3.50, it's because flour is the main ingredient of a cake. And regular flour costs, I've got an example here, an ordinary McDougall flour, £1.40 a kilo. If you don't use regular flour, as we don't, and we substitute it with ground almonds, they cost £10.60 a kilo. I'm not talking about the kosher LePesach ones, they may even cost more. But the regular ones in the supermarket, £10 the price of, 10 times the price of flour. Potato flour, £14.60 a kilo instead of £1.40 a kilo. 12 times the price of regular flour. And as you know, we use lots and lots of eggs over Pesach. Well, eggs are £35 a kilo. So really, Pesach products are expensive because the raw materials are expensive. I don't honestly believe, having some insight into the way things are manufactured, that anybody is unreasonable. And there's huge competition today. I don't think that anybody is unreasonably charging ridiculous prices. May I just advise you that there is much, much more information about Pesach to be found on our website and the United Synagogue website, Living and Learning. Many articles, a lot more information about products. And we have our in extremis list again this year if people are living in communities. There are problems in some communities in Belfast, maybe even in Dublin. People living in different far-flung areas. There are Yidden all over the country. And we do allow certain products. If in extremis you cannot find a product which is kosher LePesach, you can find it all on our website, kosher.org.uk. I do apologize once again that I wasn't able to show you the slides and something went wrong with our technology, but I thank you very much for listening, and I wish you a Chag kosher v'sameach. We don't wish about any other festival. You used to have a kosher Shavuos or a kosher Sukkos, but now hopefully you've got some deeper understanding as to why the traditional greeting for Pesach is a kosher and Pesach, a happy and kosher and indeed healthy Pesach to you all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Conway. Again, apologizing for some of the technical difficulties. We were able to see the slides. So it did work. It was a bit small, but thank God we definitely saw the images. So thank you very much again for your time. And just to echo what we've learned tonight, we started with Lachma Anya. We ended with the kashrus of Pesach products. It's fascinating about the price of flour, by the way. I didn't know that at all. Very fascinating. So there we are. Just again, wishing everyone a good Chag Kosher v'Sameach, and those who would like to find out more information about the Matmid program, there are various other shuls who are joining after Pesach. We're learning the background and some of the laws of Avelis of mourning. We shouldn't know it, but good to learn it. Following those 3 sessions, Dayan Binstock will be giving a shir about burial. And then after Shavuos, we're going to learn three sessions with your local rabbi, depending on the shul, about Shabbos, technology on Shabbos, other elements of Shabbos. And then Dayan Geli will be giving the season-ending share on that. Thank you very much, Barry in the background, who was briefly not in the background. Thank you for sorting everything out. And Chag Kosher Sameach, everyone should have a wonderful Pesach.